This is Hannibal here from thehannibaltv.com, and today I have the co-founder of the UFC, the author of Is This Legal? The inside story of the first UFC from the man who created it. He was also working with K1 for a while, and he was behind the X-Arm fighting, arm wrestling shows that are popular online, at least. I don't know what happened with them, but I guess we'll find out. Art Davie, how are you doing today, sir?
Hey, it's a pleasure. Doing well today. Thank you.
How has the book been going for you? I understand that the sales were really good and it had good feedback.
The book was published 8 years ago, and it's been doing well. It's been selling on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Apple, and we did a little social media marketing the last couple of days because the 12th of November was the 29th anniversary of UFC One. And we got a tremendous response to some of those posts on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And so I've heard from some people that I haven't heard from in a while, and I've got, I guess, some new fans. It's kind of good.
What was the toughest part about creating that UFC when you were first starting with it? Because I know a lot of the times you had after the first one, different cities trying to cancel it, but as far as the actual first one, I don't think you had too many people opposing you from putting it on in Colorado, I believe. But I'm sure there was lots of other factors that you had to deal with.
The um, the opposition came later, and probably due in some part to our publicity. I mean, we were telling people it was no holds barred, and when people saw the event, the first event, it was pretty clear that this wasn't professional wrestling and it wasn't boxing. So the media and the politicians came out of the woodwork, and it was easy to oppose us. It's kind of like pornography. If you ask a politician, is pornography good? They'll say probably not, and we probably should do something to tamp it down. And that was what happened somewhere between 1994 and 1997. Now, the first event, which I really started on kind of in 1992, I first had to get Horian Gracie convinced to do it because he wanted to do the Gracie Challenge, which had not been successful because he had never found anybody who was willing to put up $100,000 to compete against either him or one of his brothers. So the first event was really a question of getting someone in television interested. And as I tell the story in my book, Is This Legal? Which is kind of the story of that whole multi-year period leading up to UFC One, I got turned down by HBO. I got turned down by Showtime. I got turned down by ESPN. I was lucky in that I found Semaphore Entertainment Group. They had been doing pay-per-view. They had been doing concerts like Bruce Springsteen and the Judds. And they had been doing comedy, Andrew Dice Clay. So I was lucky to find them because they were financed by Bertelsmann's music group in Europe. And at that time, back in the early 90s, anybody in the music business of any consequence, Madonna, Michael Jackson, they had all been in business at some point with Bertelsmann's music group. They were actually the largest, biggest privately owned entertainment company on the planet. So getting Semaphore Entertainment and BMG allowed us to move forward. And then the problem was finding fighters. I had to advertise. I had to call. And in those days, you used the fax machine. You sent faxes out to the different martial arts organizations, the different schools, the different dojos. So I was running ads in Black Belt Magazine, Inside Karate, and Inside Kung Fu.
Is there anyone that you were looking to get that you didn't end up getting? Hulk Hogan apparently tells a story that you were trying to get him, and there's a fan on here asking if there's any truth to that.
The truth is that I had no desire to go get Hulk Hogan. And I knew I wouldn't have been able to get him under any circumstance. It was the same category of athlete like Mike Tyson. You could want Mike Tyson. He was in prison. And if he was available, it would have cost you, millions of dollars to be able to get him. So there were people like Dennis Alexio that I wanted to get, who had been in the movie, Bloodsport, the story of Frank Dukes, 1988. And I remember reaching out to him and he turned me down. I remember James Bone Crusher Smith as a pro boxer. Couldn't get him. And I remember speaking to Emmanuel Stewart at the Kronk Gym in Detroit. And he said, let me understand this right. You want to get a guy in karate pajamas to fight a heavyweight pro boxer? He said, that ain't going to happen. He said, if you ever come up to visit me here in Detroit, he said, bring me some of that stuff that you're smoking. I'd like to smoke it too.
What was your reaction when you finally had the first UFC fight and saw the very first fight? Was it what you expected, or were you at all disappointed?
No, I wasn't disappointed. I was actually prepared because I had seen enough mixed match bouts in the back of the Gracie Academy in Torrance. I had seen guys come in with black belts in Taekwondo, in Kempo, and I had seen them submitted by the Gracies. I knew that the Gracies would do well because, quite frankly, everybody, due to the movies in Hollywood, was aware of karate. They were aware of Taekwondo. They were aware of Kung Fu because of Bruce Lee. But really, not enough people were really thinking clearly about what about grappling? How would grappling figure in? Now, I had tried to reach out to Dan Gable at the University of Iowa. And I tell the story, and there's this legal. I could never get him on the phone. I wanted to get a top-notch amateur wrestler. Later on, I got Mark Schultz. I got Kevin Jackson. But in the beginning, I couldn't even get Gable's assistant to return my call. So the first event went pretty much like I expected it. And I had set up the matchmaking on the first event. I had done that on Wednesday night, 2 days before the event. I was still adjusting it and tweaking it because I really wanted the two best fighters to end up in the finals. And who were the two best fighters? I knew I had to get the best kicker puncher. And I said, let's see who the best grappler is. So I had set it up so that I eventually ended up with Gerard Gordeau, who as a kickboxer out of Holland had been to Thailand, had fought in Japan, who was competent at leg kicks. I wound up with the best kicker puncher, and I had matched in the semifinals the two best grapplers, Ken Shamrock and Royce Gracie. So who did I get in the final? Shamrock, Gracie versus Gordeau. It was perfect. So the first event went beautifully, in my opinion. I was very pleased.
There was a fan that wanted to know, what did the guys that lost in the first round get paid on the first event?
$1,000.
$1,000. Wow. Now, I've heard you tell a story about Tank Abbott in Puerto Rico beating up somebody in the elevator. He's very popular on this channel. I've interviewed him probably 4 or 5 times. So I was wondering if you could tell that.
Tank is, people have asked me on the 29th anniversary on Saturday, they said, was Tank a difficult guy to work with? Tank was a great guy to work with. He was very smart. He was very clear on what his appeal was. And quite frankly, I have been looking for someone like Tank. Why? Everybody with a black belt in karate used to say to me, well, I think I can handle anybody. I said, well, who might you be worried about? Well, maybe some night in a bar, I might run into some guy, 6'4", who's 280 pounds and, was a Hell's Angel. I said, so you're worried about some big brawler. Well, I'm not worried about it. So I was looking for Tank, and I was glad when we brought Tank in. Tank became a star. He became one of the most popular fighters we had. Now at UFC 6 in Casper, Wyoming, I had Tank there, and I was real excited about the fact that Tank, I thought, might end up as the Ultimate Fighter. And he wound up, of course, facing a great grappler, Igor, the great Russian Bear, the Russian Bear, and the altitude was a factor for both men. And I wound up with not Tank winning that first event, but Tank and Pat Smith had spoken to each other during the event, before the event, at the press conference, and I knew that there was some sort of friction between them. I'm having breakfast the next morning in the hotel coffee shop with John McCarthy, and I'm sitting there, and John and I are having a conversation, and we see everybody running down the hallway to the elevators. And I'm hearing people, there's screaming or noise coming from that direction. So John and I got up and went in that direction, and we started to run. And Maurice Smith at one point beat us. He ran faster than we did. He got down to the elevator in time. What had happened was Tank Abbott, Tito Ortiz, and Paul Herrera, and one other guy was part of their posse, a young Hispanic from Los Angeles, had mugged Pat Smith in the elevator. When I got to the elevator, Maurice Smith was holding Pat Smith in his arms, and Pat was bleeding from his mouth. And I see Abbott going down the hallway to the other elevators, and who just passes me is Tito Ortiz and Paul Herrera. So they actually mugged Pat Smith in the elevator. That's the story, and that's a true story.
So you were with John Wayne Bobbitt. Why didn't you pursue having him fight in the UFC? Because that would have had a lot of media attention back in those days.
Well, he had come all the way out to Casper on his own, and they had put him in the on the front page of the Gillette newspaper in Wyoming. And he was having breakfast with John and I that next morning, that Saturday morning, and he was telling me he was a black belt in Taekwondo. I said, all right. So I was considering putting him in, but in all fairness, John Wayne Bobbitt didn't follow up on that. After the event, I didn't hear from him.
Were there any other celebrities that contacted you about possibly fighting in there?
Back in the day, I don't remember any famous actors. And fans would ask me, gee, why didn't you try to go get, Jean-Claude Van Damme, or why didn't you try to go get Chuck Norris? And of course, the story is that Horian and I asked Chuck Norris to come to the first event, maybe even commentate. And he declined. In fact, he kept saying, is this legal? He kept thinking that, maybe the sheriff was going to show up, or the police, or the Marines. He didn't want to come. So there was never a chance that I was going to get a very famous name in the martial arts, and certainly no famous actor. Nobody was going to. And at the time, we were doing, a $60,000 to $75,000 first prize, which was good money in the martial arts. I remember that Chuck Norris once did an interview in which he said, I competed and won the World Middleweight Open Karate Championship at Madison Square Garden. He said, they gave me a trophy. He said it was about this big. And he said, I got $1,000. And he said, I had gotten injured in that tournament. And he said, my medical doctor bills were almost $1,000. He said, I broke even. So by the UFC being able to give the Ultimate Fighting Champion $75,000, that was a big deal. It didn't compare to boxing, but then again, what did?
Yeah. And of course, back in those days, as you said, it wasn't really on TV that much. It was mostly videotape and pay-per-views. So,
well, you have to remember though, my original idea, I had really only two original ideas, because this was not a new idea when you looked into it. The idea for no holds barred fighting goes back to the ancient Greek Olympics, pancration. The two original ideas I had was doing a single elimination tournament. That meant you had to defeat 3 different fighters in one night. And the second idea I had was I knew I couldn't bring it to broadcast TV or to cable, and it belonged on pay-per-view. But what was on pay-per-view? Porn, which was big business, boxing, which was big, and professional wrestling. So when we started to do it on pay-per-view, by the first couple of shows, we were doing 300,000 subscribers, and the price climbed from $15 eventually to $30 for a subscriber. We also had a deal with Vidmark, and those events that went from pay-per-view a week or so later, 2 weeks later, they'd be in the video stores where you could rent them. Between pay-per-view and the video, we were doing good business. But pay-per-view was 70% of our revenue, not the videos and not the live event. We would put 5, 6, 10,000 people in a live event, but the real money was on pay-per-view.
Matthew Granahan, who hooked us up for this interview, wants to know about the Zane Frazier Frank Dukes fight at the convention back in the day.
That's a true story. And the King of Connecticut has got a good question about it. I had met Kathy Kidd, who was an event coordinator for a martial arts trade show in Pasadena. She had come into the Gracie Academy and she had asked Horion if he was interested in maybe getting a booth at this martial arts trade show. So Horion at the time was, was still selling his videos in a little article and a little ad in Black Belt magazine, and he wasn't interested in going to the show. But I met her there at the academy, and she invited me to come out that Saturday, and she gave me a pass. By the time that I got there and came in the front door, the police were there, and there had been some sort of a brawl. And I'm trying to find out what's going on. And who comes up to me is Zane Frazier. He said, "Mr. Davie," he said, I was hoping you were going to come here. I wanted to meet you. I just kicked Frank Dukes' ass. I said, "What?" He tells me the whole story. They knew each other, and they had gotten into some kind of an argument. And apparently, I heard different versions of it. I don't know whether Zane hit him or pushed him or threw him over a table. But when I got there, the cops were interviewing everybody. They even asked me a question. They said, "Why are you here?" And I had heard about Zane Frazier from Frank Trejo. Frank Trejo and Horion Gracie had done some seminars together. And I knew that Zane was the International Kickboxing Federation's super heavyweight champ. So one of the reasons that I had gone to that show is that I saw in the material that Kathy gave me was that Zane was going to be there. That's how we met.
There was a few fans that wanted to know why you guys chose Hoist over Rickson Gracie. I guess it wasn't your choice. And from what I understand, they wanted the weaker looking guy in there. Is that about right?
Well, the true story is the first fighter that I signed for the UFC was Pat Smith. Now, I had gone up in the early part of the year around February and March and got us a corporation, an LLC. I got us an attorney. I got us an accountant. I got us a bank account and a safety deposit box. And then I went over to Tiger Kim's gym on Colfax Avenue, and I watched Pat Smith working out, hitting the bag and sparring. And I knew he had won the Sabaki Challenge earlier that year at McNichols Arena, which was a bare knuckle karate championship. He was the first fighter I signed. So when I got back, and now I'm starting to get some calls on the ads in the 3 magazines, I'm starting now to recruit fighters. Kevin Rozier, I gotten Gerard Gordeau by calling gyms in Holland, the Chakariki gym, the Johan Plas gym. And I'm asking Horion, I said, "Which one of your brothers am I getting?" I'm assuming it's Rickson. And Horion said, I'll tell you when. I said, "Well, Horion, I'm starting to sign other fighters. When am I going to get?" And he said, "You wait." Horion was trying to figure it out, and I think he was having some discussion with Rickson, who at that time apparently had taken some students and was privately teaching them over at his house in his garage. And when Horion found out about it, he was pretty upset. Then he found out that it happened twice. So I knew that there was some friction with Horion. Finally, in August, I said to Horion, we're going to do an event in September, October. I need to know right now because I'm starting to create materials with Semaphore for the event, advertising. Finally, Horion said to me, "It's going to be Hoist." I said, "Hoist?" I knew Hoist from the academy. He was the guy that at the end of the day, he had the broom, he'd be sweeping up. And on Saturday, he would come into the Horion's office, and Horion would open the safe, and he would give Hoist 3 $20 bills so Hoist could go out to the beach, do a little surfing, buy himself some lunch. He didn't have a checking account. He didn't have a credit card. I knew he had a driver's license, and he lived in a small room over the garage at Horion's house, a tiny little apartment, and he had a 6-sided fish tank with 2 piranhas. And once a week, he would go to the pet store and he would get goldfish, a bag of goldfish, and he would feed them to the piranhas. I said, Hoist is just a big kid. Hoist at the time was 28, but he seemed like 18. But Horian said to me, he says, you know the advantage? I said, what advantage? He said, it's like Bruce Lee. He said, Hoist goes in there weighing 175 pounds. He said, I know you're getting some big guys. And I, by that time, had gotten a sumo wrestler at 400 pounds. He said, if the smallest guy wins, he said, what is that going to say about jujitsu? I said, that's pretty smart. And that's what happened. I didn't pick Hoist. Horian Gracie did.
Why did all the Gracies jump to Pride in 97 when it was founded? Was that just better money, or was there some other friction between them and UFC at the time?
I'll tell you the true story. At the first UFC, at the party on Saturday, I remember sitting right behind me at a table was Rickson Gracie and his wife, Kim. And Kim, in Portuguese, was telling Rickson, you let your brother rodeo you. You should have been in this event. Kim Gracie was very smart. And Hoist had made the mistake at either UFC 1 or UFC 2, I think it happened. Some Japanese journalists had come in from Tokyo, and they said to Hoist, you're incredible. This Gracie jiu-jitsu, this Brazilian jiu-jitsu that you're doing, it's magnificent. And Hoist was saying, you know, in my family, it's not a big deal. I'm not the best. They said, you're not the best? What do you mean? He said, no, my brother Rickson's the best. Well, immediately those journalists went and got a hold of Kim Gracie. And I heard that Kim Gracie, the first time she ever talked to a promoter in Japan, her opening price was $1 million. I don't know if that's the truth, but that's the rumor I heard. She was a great salesman for Rickson. So the Gracies, I could never get Rickson to come into the UFC. I remember after UFC 3 having dinner with him at the Brazilian restaurant in Torrance and asking him, and he turned me down.
Interesting. How did you become involved with K1? Were you with them from the start behind the scenes, or at what point did you become involved with them?
Well, somewhere in 1997, my non-compete had expired. When we sold the UFC, when I say we, I'm talking about WOW Promotions, the LLC that Horian Gracie and I founded in Colorado. When that non-compete expired in June of 1997, I began to think about maybe starting another event. Now, in all fairness, we were under a lot of pressure from the media and from the politicians. And quite frankly, Semaphore Entertainment was having to hire both a criminal and a civil attorney in all of these cities that we went to in 97 in order to be able to get this event on in that city and on TV. And by the fall, by September, October, we lost pay-per-view, viewers' choice and request under pressure, maybe from Senator McCain, who was on the Commerce Committee in the United States Senate. Maybe that's what maybe made them decide to drop the UFC. So my thinking about wanting to go and start another event was kind of a daydream because look at the problems we had at the UFC with keeping it going. On the other hand, I had talked to a number of people, and one of them ran to Bob Meyerowitz and said, our Davie is thinking about starting a new event. He's trying to raise millions. So Bob called me up in January of 98, and he said, Art, is it true? I said, yes, Bob, it is. So Bob and I parted company as friends to this day. And who called me 3 or 4 days later? Kazuyoshi Ishii from Tokyo. He said, I want you to be the president of K1 USA. I want you to bring K1 to America. That's how it happened.
How was putting on that event at the Thomas and Mack Center where you guys had a packed house, I believe, and the match I remember from that was I think it was Sean O'Hare against Butterbean where Butterbean just demolished him.
Oh, you're talking about the K1 event?
Yeah.
Well, the K1 event was done in August of 1998 and was done at the Mirage Hotel. It was on pay-per-view. And I remember that I had Andy Hoog, who had been K1 champion from Switzerland. I had Maurice Smith. I had Ernesto Hoost, the other K1 champion. On the other hand, I early on had asked Ishii for access to the content I wanted to be able to put the content on ESPN. I had a deal working with ESPN where we could run K1 every night from 10 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning. I wanted fans at home on cable TV to see this K1 thing for 6 months. And I couldn't get the content. And I asked Ishii, I said, why can't I bring the content to American users? ESPN will let me do it for free. I said, I'm getting free publicity. And Ishii told me the true story. Sony had now owned the K1 content, and they weren't prepared to let ESPN in America run it. So I had tremendous difficulty promoting that event on pay-per-view. I was also in the same month with a boxing match with Mike Tyson, and the wrestling in August of 1998 was at Sturgis. The WWE was at Sturgis with all the motorcyclists. So I had 2 events that month, which made it very difficult. It was very hard to make K1 work in America. The other problem was that there weren't really a lot of great kickboxers in America. That's why K1 always brought them in from Europe or from Asia.
It seems like UFC now isn't really at a height in popularity. I know they're making probably more money than ever, but it just doesn't seem like there's as many smaller MMA leagues around or as many people training in it. What would you do to kind of boost things? Is it just a matter of there's not enough stars, or what do you think the issue is?
Well, I think that the UFC has become the analogy to the NFL and football. You can see the difficulty that Bellator has had being owned by Viacom to be able to compete with the UFC. I think the PFL and with Lauren Mack and Don Davis over there are trying very hard to become the number 2. Quite frankly, if you become good, at MMA, either in Europe or in America, and there are a lot of, MMA franchises like Gladiator Challenge in California. There's MMA in South Africa. If you become any good at MMA, you know where you wind up? At the UFC. They've always had between 400 to 600 fighters under contract. So I think the fighters are out there. I think the UFC is sitting at the top of the iceberg, at the top of the world. And quite frankly, from what I hear and from what I understand from people in television, their numbers are excellent. So, the UFC sold for $4 billion in 2017 to William Morris Endeavor. So I think that tells you just how big the UFC really is. That's the kind of sale price that would have come with the New York Yankees or the Dallas Cowboys, really.
Yeah, it's definitely making tons of money, but it just seems like there's not as many active stars. But I know that like John Jones has been out for a while now, and Connor's fighting less and less. Peter says they should bring back no weight classes. I know that's one thing I liked about the original UFC. Could that ever happen again, or would the commissions just
No,
ex-nate?
I think that's a really good question and a really good observation. But I'll tell you the difficulty with that. My good friend Gary Goodrich is over in Africa as we speak, and he's hooked up with a couple of investors over there in Nairobi, and they want to found something called the African Fighting Championship, the AFC. So he said to me, we're thinking about doing an open weight, kind of a no holds barred event. I said, I'll tell you what the problem with that is, even in Africa. You'll do okay in Nairobi. As soon as you, though, try to bring that finished product on video to Europe or the United States, you're up against the fact that there's now a unified rules of MMA. And that's become the standard everywhere. So if you're going to try to go around that and do something that goes back to what I did in 1993, you'll find it would be difficult, if not impossible, to get TV support. And without TV support, you're just a local promoter in a particular market relying on live events and merchandise sales. That's a tough way to make $1 million.
True. Alex wants to know if there was any truth to WWE wanting to buy UFC at one point. That might be after you were already out of it.
That's a good question, but I don't think that during the time that I was there that I ever got any kind of a feeler at all. I remember talking at one point to Eric Bischoff when he was with the WCW, and he had a fighter that I wanted, a wrestler by the name of Menga, a big Samoan. And I had heard from professional wrestlers that everyone was afraid of him. This guy could really fight outside of a wrestling ring. I remember talking to Eric Bischoff, and I wanted to see if we could work out a deal. We would kind of maybe do a little cross promotion for what they were doing. I just wanted Menga. I couldn't get him. But I eventually brought in Tony Halme, Count Ludwig Vorga, and I matched up against Randy Couture, and Randy beat him. So I was always interested from the early shows, and I was always fascinated by getting not only the best fighter, but I always said, we're in show business. This is entertainment. I think a lot of the fans appreciated the early UFC because, hey, we understood we were there to entertain you. And my job was to find anybody and everybody. Pro boxer, sumo wrestler, Kajukenbo, karate, Penjak Silat, Sambo, wherever they were, Brooklyn, Norway, Thailand, Buenos Aires, I wanted them. And if they were colorful, that's why I was able to get Tank Abbott. I wanted colorful, interesting people. By the way, one of the best fighters I ever had, one of the most colorful, undefeated in the octagon, was Frank Shamrock. Great individual, great fighter.
Who was one of the guys that you had issues with backstage dealing with that you had to keep around, maybe because he was a draw or a good fighter, but he was a pain in the ass to deal with?
Well, people could ask about Tank, about whether or not Tank was a problem. Tank and I always got along very well. I liked Tank, and from the first time I met him. And, he came to my office. He was wearing like Levi's or Dockers, and he had a button-down shirt. He had no beard and mustache in those days, and he had a little bag with him. And he said to me, well, where am I going to fight today? I want to show you what I can do. We're sitting in my office. I said, what do you mean fight? He said, well, isn't there a gym right? Put me up against somebody right now. So Tank early on was a brawler. I love that about him. And I had heard stories that he would go and work. He would go and compete in some of the state parks in California. He would show up with his posse, and somebody would show up with their posse, and they would park their cars, and everybody would turn their lights on. And Tank had $1,000 in the pants pocket of his jeans, and the karate black belt or the other tough guy he was up against, he had $1,000, and they would fight. And whoever won would take the other guy's $1,000. I was looking for Tank. Tank was a hard guy to deal with, but I got to tell you something. He could sell tickets, and he and I got along. And he was one of the only people who called me when Bob Myrowitz and I split after UFC Japan. The guy who called me that Monday morning was David Tank Abbott to tell me that he was always supportive of me and was wishing me the best luck. I have a lot of respect for that guy.
Do you think they'll put him in the Hall of Fame eventually, or has he just been too outspoken about Dana White to get in there?
That's a very good question. When I was put into the Hall of Fame in 2018, I give a lot of credit to Ant Evans. Ant Evans was a big supporter of mine. He had read my book, and he knew who I was, in terms of the MMA world. And I gave a very good speech that night at the Hall of Fame, and I gave full credit, to a number of people. I gave credit to Jason Cusson, who was one of the two people who designed the Octagon. I gave credit to Mark Lucas, our director, because as much as I created the event, an 8-man tournament, Lucas was the guy who created the look of the show. He figured out how many cameras, he figured out the lighting. And Semaphore had only done concerts. It was easy to light Bruce Springsteen. I remember Bob Myrowitz calling me up before the first show and saying, Mark Lucas says we need an overhead camera mounted on a jib. He said, nobody in boxing does that. I said, Lucas understands that in this event, guys are going to get into a clinch, and it's going to end up a lot of times on the canvas. The viewers in the arena and at home, we have to explain that to them. You need an overhead camera. That was another $10,000, $12,000.
Alex wants to know, was there ever any consideration to have brother against brother, Ken Shamrock versus Frank Shamrock?
Not during the time that I was there. I heard some interesting stories from Jason DeLucia, who was my alternate in UFC 1 and went over to Pancrase. In fact, when he visited me at UFC, I think in Buffalo, UFC 7, I wanted to get him back into the UFC, but Ken Shamrock was operating at that point out of the Lions Den, and he was competing in Pancrase. And I had heard some interesting stories about the kind of initiation that Ken Shamrock had given Frank Shamrock at the Lions Den. So I knew that those guys had mixed it up more than once. And I knew there was no chance that I'd be able to get those two guys in the octagon together. I also think that while he was alive, Bob Shamrock, who was their adopted father, would not have approved or permitted that. That's a good question, though.
A long story short wants to know if Bloodsport, the movie, or Street Fighter, the video game, had any influence on UFC. And also, is it true you originally wanted like an alligator pit around the octagon?
Well, the true story is that I had two crazy ideas early on when we were trying to figure out what we were going to, what kind of an arena we were going to put this in. And Bob Marowitz wanted a boxing ring. He said, we can rent a boxing ring for $5,000. He said, that's not rocket science. Let's rent a boxing ring. Rorion Gracie, though, had told me that in Brazil, at Vale Tudo, they had gotten away from the boxing ring because the smart guy, who, when they got to the canvas, would roll out underneath the ropes, and that would stop the event so that the referee had to bring both men back to the center and stand them up. He was adamant that we could not do a boxing ring. So early on, we were like spitballing ideas. I had two goofy ideas that were mine, and Rorion shot them down right away. One of them, I said, how about we do something with a moat? And I mentioned it to Michael Pilot, our line producer at Semaphore. He said, a moat? He said, what are you going to put in the moat? I said, we'll fill it with water. I said, and we'll put the lemon sharks in. I said, they're not really vicious. I said, if we feed them, they'll be as tame as catfish. He said, we're going to have to fill it up. And then when we break the octagon, the cage down at the end, we have to drain it. He said, that's the dumbest idea. And when I told it to Rorion just rubbed his head like, that's nutty. The second crazy idea I had was to do a wushu ring, 40 feet across. Only on one of the outer perimeters of the ring, we would have a copper embedded into the mat, a copper ring, and we'd electrify it. And while I'm telling Rorion this, one of his students, who was a cardiologist, came into Horion's office, and he's listening to me tell this story to Rorion, and he starts to laugh. And I said, well, why are you laughing? What's funny? He said, do you know what the word ventricular fibrillation means? I said, that's like a heart attack. He said, anybody who's sweating, who lands on that ring on his chest, you'll kill him. Rorion starts laughing and said, Art, no more crazy ideas. The true story is Semaphore went and got two set designers from Hollywood, Greg Harrison and Jason Cusson. Their job was to build sets on movies, a town, a spaceship, giant rocks like it's out in the wilderness, boulders. And they're the ones who came up with the 5 sketches. And once we looked at the 5 sketches, Semaphore and WOW all came to the same conclusion. The one that we eventually called the Octagon, that was the one.
One thing I got to ask you about before we wrap this up is the X-Arm that you were involved with, which for anyone that doesn't know, it was like a fighting arm wrestling type of thing. What happened with that?
I got a call from a friend of mine named Russell Naftal, who was, I think, working at the time with the people who did the Muppets. And he said, I got a friend of mine who's up in Seattle, and they're having lunch one day. They're a production company. They do commercials for Starbucks, for Microsoft, up there in Washington, Seattle. He said, they're having lunch one day, and they started to fool around about arm wrestling. And one of the guys at the table said, hey, what about if we were arm wrestling and I reached across and smacked you with a left hook? So they started to laugh about it, and they started to think about it. So they called this guy, Russell Naftal, up that I knew, and they said, we wanted to come up with a new idea for a sport, a fighting sport, and we think we have it. So they said, can you help us? He said, well, I can introduce you to 2 guys. He said, one guy is Hulk Hogan. He said, if you want to make it a spectacle, he said, Hogan might be the guy because he comes from the wrestling world. And he said, if you've got a wacky idea, and they had described it in, I guess, a couple of sentences to him, and sounded nuts, cross between arm wrestling and hitting. He said, the other guy that I can introduce you to, if you want to make it into a sport, is Art Davie. And that's what happened. They decided they wanted to make it into a sport. They called me up. They flew down. They wrote me a check. And I wound up hiring Ted Williams over at Gladiator Challenge to be my assistant. And he was the one, between he and I, we came up with the rules, and we wound up designing a 28-inch by 16-inch table and built it on a giant platform. And with the funding from the Piranha Group, Piranha Production Company in Seattle, that's how we got going. We eventually got funding from a number of websites. We got funding from a big group in Holland that was involved in entertainment. But I eventually came to the people in cable TV, and they looked at it and they said, you know something? This is not as good as the UFC, because the UFC, you were drawing on the fact that there's a lot of high school and college wrestlers, that every strip mall has a karate or a taekwondo school. So there's a huge feeder system. He said, you're doing something with X-Arm where you're actually having to bring fighters into a workshop and train them to do this. He said, there's not much legs on this. So I could never get anybody in cable that really wanted to write me a check. After 4 years, we eventually pulled the plug.
And last question, what's your opinion on the success of the Paul brothers and Jake Paul as far as pay-per-view and their whole promoting?
I think it's been brilliant. And I think what it points out is that you've got a whole generation of youngsters today, who are 17 years old, that know the social media, and that if you want to build, an awareness today, you need to have some ability to be able to create yourself as a personality on social media. The Paul brothers, those guys have done a great job. It's brilliant. And today you with the internet, you're reaching not just North America, you're reaching anybody and everyone, from someplace in Kuala Lumpur, someplace in Gothenburg, Sweden, in South Africa, Nairobi. The world market today, more than ever, is for personalities who know how to market themselves. The Paul brothers, those guys are smart.
And as far as where people can find your book, Is This Legal, and where they can follow you on social media, can you let us know where they can do that?
On Instagram, I'm UFC Creator. On Twitter, I'm at UFC Creator. And if they want to get the book, it's isthislegalthebook.com. Isthislegalthebook.com.
I may actually get that, and maybe after I read it, you'll come back on, and I could ask you some questions about it.
That would be great. I would enjoy that.
Excellent. Thanks. Well, I appreciate you coming on. I know you're a very busy guy, and I'll let you close this off with whatever you want to say to the fans.
I would say this. Who really made the UFC are the fans. The fighters couldn't do it without them. They were the important ones compared to me and Horion and Semaphore. But who really kept the UFC going in the dark years? It was the fans. They had bulletin boards, and they were sharing the fact that they found the videos and look, let's be on the alert for the next event. The fans kept this thing going. The fans have made the UFC and MMA the sport that it is. I thank all the fans out there. Without you guys, none of this would have ever happened.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and click the subscribe button to not miss